Why do the teachings on divorce differ in Mark and Matthew? Jesus, via Matthew's gospel, seems to allow the exception of unchastity. This is really interesting, isn't it? So we have a comparison here. In fact, Luke even talks about this issue of divorce. But we have a really interesting situation where in Mark's gospel, it says in chapter 10, and the Pharisees came up in order to test him, asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" And he answered them, "What did Moses command you?" And they said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to put her away." And Jesus said to them, "For your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Now, what the Pharisees are referring to here is Deuteronomy chapter 24. Now, Deuteronomy is an interesting part of salvation history because Deuteronomy, the second law, as it's translated, it is a review of the people of God walking through the desert, and you have some laws that crop up that are not necessarily God's law, but they are provisional laws given by Moses due to the hardness of their heart. So, for example, you could not get a divorce unless your spouse died. Well, what we found was that due to the hardness of their heart, guess what? Their spouse died. And maybe they didn't like their cooking. Maybe they didn't like the way they dressed. I don't know what it was, but there was abuse in this area, and people go missing, right? Some guy goes to work and hires a young secretary, and before you know it, his wife's missing. Well, she must be dead so he can marry the secretary. So the abuse took place, and Moses gave this certificate of divorce back in Deuteronomy. But now in the New Testament, the question is, well, Moses gave this certificate of divorce. What say you? And Jesus is very, very clever here and very, very to the point. He says, guys, it wasn't that way from the beginning. It was because of the hardness of your heart. And so he, in a sense, dismisses this provisional law put in by Moses and brings you back to the very beginning of the Bible, and that God is the one who created marriage and brought men and women together, and they are one. They become one. Now, in Matthew's gospel, and what our questioner is asking about here, is that it's basically the same, except that it gives a clause, an exceptionary clause here when it says in verse 9 of chapter 19, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery." Now, we know that the church's teaching is that there is no room for divorce. When you are married forever. It's kind of like priests. Priests are priests forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And when a man and woman are sacramentally bound, they are married for life. But it looks almost like Jesus is making an exception for unchastity. That word unchastity there is a word that is related to porneia. It is related to sexual unchastity, but not clear exactly what it is. Now, can someone get a divorce because their mate was unfaithful? Well, they can get an annulment if they go to the church and they study their marriage and they find out that it was in fact not valid. And there's a lot that goes into that. I don't have time to go through it today. But when it comes to just unchastity, it doesn't appear that is what Jesus is talking about as far as, okay, your mate had an affair, now you can get a divorce. That isn't what he's talking about here, apparently, for two reasons. One, nowhere else in the New Testament does it say it. Paul doesn't say that. And the response of the disciples, they were blown away. In fact, their response was, well, it'd probably be better than never even marry then. So if you could get a divorce simply because of unchastity, and you really wanted a divorce, well, then you could be unchaste. You could go out and have a relationship and say, there it is. Now I can get a divorce. Obviously, that's not what the Lord is talking about there. Scholars have argued about this for years, but suffice it to say, we are called to a relationship in marriage that is for life. If you enjoyed this video and you still have more questions about the Bible, remember to subscribe to this channel and download the free Ascension app for more Bible answers.